We conducted a study on the repatriation of American Depository Receipts, or ADRs, based on Brazilian companies, and we found that the protection of minority shareholder rights is the key factor to bring investors back to the domestic market, and that it takes over a decade to regain investors' trust. Towards the end of the 1990s, the Brazilian capital market was becoming increasingly irrelevant. As can be seen in the left side of the graph below, the value traded on Bovespa declined 75% during the 5 years beginning in 1998. Minority investors in Brazil during the 1990s enjoyed the lowest level of protection among most other capital markets. A study by Dyke and Zingales on shareholder rights found that private benefits of control comprised 65% of the firm equity value in Brazil. An example of minority rights abuse was the merger between Ambev and Interbrew, where ordinary shares soared while preference shares dropped by 30%. Another example of minority rights abuse was Telemar's share swap, in which investors in non-voting shares would have their stakes heavily diluted from 71.5% to 45.4%. Fortunately, in this case, Brazilian regulator CVM intervened. As a result, investors lost trust, and this raised the cost of capital to Brazilian companies, which prompted them to list ADRs to signal investors their commitment to protect minority shareholders' rights. Between 1995 to 1999, Brazilian companies raised $32 billion in ADRs compared to $550 million in domestic equity offerings. ADRs became the preferred vehicle of trade in Brazilian equities by 2008. The graph on this slide shows us the fall in Bovespa's market share in Brazilian equities, which was later reversed by the Novo Mercado initiative. The Novo Mercado initiative introduced higher corporate governance requirements to protect minority investors by essentially prohibiting preference shares. It took more than 10 years to start the repatriation process. As the Novo Mercado initiative became the standard for new Brazilian companies seeking to go public, many Brazilian companies opted to list on Bovespa instead of tapping the US market, kicking off the repatriation trend. In 2010, Brazilian companies raised 150 billion reais on Bovespa. That compares with $208 billion raised at NYSE by all other companies during that same year. Several initiatives provided critical support to drive companies to adopt higher governance standards, and as a result, they attracted investors back to the domestic market. Among these initiatives included pension investment provisions, which authorized for a higher ceiling on stock investments if the issuing company is listed on the Novo Mercado or Level 2. In addition, pension funds could only invest in an IPO if the company were listed on the Novo Mercado or Level 2. Furthermore, the Brazilian Development Bank started granting specific incentives for companies to join the Novo Mercado, and in some cases, made such membership one of the conditions for financing. Foreign investors started to become more comfortable with directly accessing the Brazilian capital markets instead of via ADRs. The graph below shows the steady growth in the proportion of foreign investors in Bovespa's CBLC assets under custody. As companies' cost of access to capital fell, more companies chose to raise capital in the public markets. This caused the Brazilian capitalization to GDP to expand. Lower cost of capital was the result of minority protection rights, which attracted investors to the market, as well as lower costs for companies to pursue domestic listings. Finally, we see in this graph that Bovespa's velocity expanded from around 30% to over 70% as a result of the repatriation of trading through ADRs.